Okay. Very exciting. We are, as we've said, targeting the 21st for our first service over there in the new building. And as Lucas mentioned, we want to basically have like a kind of a load-in day / open house on the 14th. So that'll be kind of the day, Lord willing, when we are done with the trailer. After the service on the 14th, we will no longer need the trailer. And so we could, yeah, right. And all the guys who work really hard, I call them the men, they have their gloves, their work glove, the work glove crew in the morning. Those guys work hard on loading that trailer, loading it back up on Sundays. But that will be a thing of the past. And so after the Sunday the 14th, we want to go and unload that over there and just have an opportunity to pray and celebrate and have you go and see the facility for yourself before we move in there on the 21st. Again, Lord willing, it'll be the 21st. But we are working with the city, right? The city has been awesome. Whenever you're working with the city, though, there's a possibility for things to get pushed back a little bit. So the 2nd, that's this Tuesday, as Lucas mentioned, that is our hearing, our public hearing for our use permit. Yes? Right. I don't know. I need to find out, actually. I literally, I don't know. So if you are interested in coming to that, I think it would be good to have a few of us come out to that on Tuesday evening. It'll be, and over somewhere in the maze that is City Hall. Just send me an email, and I can get you the info when I learn where we are supposed to show up on Tuesday evening. But Lord willing, that'll all go smoothly, and we will get moved into the new facility. Okay? So all very exciting stuff. We're super thankful for how the Lord has provided for us there, and just the expanded opportunity for ministry. That's going to be taking place over there at 3090 Independence Drive. Let me address something that I should have talked about this 3 weeks ago. Okay, when we first got into this section on roles and instructions for husbands, instructions for wives, we're walking through this section. The application has been very, very specific. The application has been very directed, right? The application has been mostly for husbands and wives. And I wouldn't blame you if some of you have been sitting through this and thinking, okay, I'm not a husband and I'm not a wife, so what am I supposed to do with this? And hopefully if you have been thinking that, if you've been processing that, hopefully you've had some good ideas about ways that you can be taking the information that God gives us here in Ephesians 5 and using that. But let me just specifically give us some applications for people who are neither husbands or wives in this room at this point. And specific groups that I want to speak to. If you're single and marriage might be something that you are pursuing, something that you are thinking about for the future, then I think the application of this, even though you can't apply some of these roles, some of these instructions right now, hopefully the application for you is pretty obvious, right? All of this, talking about the role of a husband, the role of a wife, this is, on the one hand, what you are aiming for, what you would want to be preparing for if someday the Lord does bring you a spouse, and it's also the blueprint for what you're looking for, right? So if you're single and marriage might be something in the future, single men out there who might be praying for the Lord to bring you a wife in the future, you look at this and say, okay, this whole sacrificial love thing, this whole laying down my life, giving myself in order to serve a wife someday, how do I prepare for that? And I would say that the best way to prepare for that, the best way to practice that, is by going and sacrificially giving yourself for other people. To serve others, to serve Christ's bride, the church. And when you can do that sacrificially as a single person, men, then you are going to be able to do that for your bride, your wife, if the Lord provides that someday. And then ladies, that's who you're looking for. You look at this and say, okay, I'm looking for a guy who will give himself with rugged determination, a rugged resolve like Christ. So you look around and you see a guy who serves other people sacrificially. That's the blueprint. Ladies, if you're single and you're looking at the role of a wife, how do you prepare for that? I'd say it's by humbly submitting yourself to God with an attitude of dependence. And just looking up to God and saying, okay, God, you are in charge. And whatever you say, that's what I'm going to do. And I am resolved to submit myself to you. And then single men, that's the blueprint that you would be looking for in a wife, a woman who has that kind of attitude. Okay, so that's one group. If you're single and marriage might be something that you'd be pursuing in the future. There's another group, though, that's represented especially here this morning that I want to specifically address. It's the kids. Kids, you're sitting in here and you're like, okay, seriously, like this is the day they don't have children's ministry and we're talking about marriage. Like, what are we doing in here? Kids, number one, yeah, you can actually be learning a lot about marriage because someday, Lord willing, He will provide you a spouse. And you need to learn what it looks like to grow up, to live out these roles. But kids, here's another thing. You probably watch your parents a lot. And you probably see your parents and they do things and they talk to each other. I would encourage you kids, pay attention today and learn about what your parents are trying to do and to be in their marriage. And you can maybe understand them a little bit better. So kids, this is something that I think it's really helpful. You pay attention today, you'll start to recognize, I see why Dad did that. Or I see what Dad's trying to do there, even if he's doing it imperfectly. You start to understand your parents a little better and what's going on. And another group is those of you, if you have been married in the past and now maybe marriage isn't something that is on the horizon for you, something that you are pursuing or planning for in your future. I think for you, you probably already know the application, though, that for you to be praying for the marriages in this room and encouraging married people, because if you have been married, you know how difficult it can be to live this out, right? And that's actually true for all of us. As we're learning about what this looks like, that we would be praying for each other, praying for the marriages in this church, and encouraging each other to live these things out. And then lastly, for all of us, what's the picture that Paul uses to illustrate all of this, right? It's Christ and the church. And so Paul's teaching about marriage, but we're also learning a whole lot about Christ and his heart for his bride, the church. That's us. There's good theology, and there's so much sweet truth about how Christ loves us in this section. So hopefully that's helpful for you to think through. If you're not a husband or a wife, what should you be doing with these messages? But having said all of that, right, this passage that we're in, this is addressed to husbands today, what we're looking at. And so my primary goal this morning, in addition to all those things that we can all be applying, my primary goal this morning, as we finish up this section, is to stir up the husbands in this church to love your wife. And I want to appeal to you husbands from this passage. I want you to think about something, husbands. I'll ask you this question. Do you remember that moment when the back door of the church swung open? Do you remember that moment when the back door of the church swung open and she was standing there. I'm not a fan, by the way, of this trend that they have now, and people are getting married, and they go and they take their first look pictures, right? Right, for like hundreds of years, it has been the tradition for your first look, your first sight of her to be as that back door of the church opens and you're standing there and you see her about to walk down the aisle. Now look, if you took first look pictures, I'm not like condemning you. But I think that there is just an something incredibly special about that moment, that first glimpse of her as she is about to come down the aisle. Do you remember, husbands, what was the song? What music did she walk down the aisle to? Maybe it was the traditional, Here Comes the Bride. Maybe it was something else. My wife walked down the aisle to a song called Brethren, We Have Met to Worship. Really beautiful song. And that song, whenever it comes on our playlist, that moment comes back. Do you remember that moment, husbands, when her dad or maybe it was somebody else handed her over to you, and you took her hand and her parents sat down, and it was just the two of you left standing there now before God? Whenever I do a wedding, I try to have the groom stand up with me on the platform for that moment and look down the aisle, and he comes, and then he's got to go down to floor level to go get his bride, and then he brings her back up. I call that the rapture in the marriage service. But what a moment that is. Husbands, do you remember that? Do you remember when she was presented to you? Guys, what if you could relive that moment and repeat that moment every single day? And more than that, actually, husbands, what if you could help her prepare for that moment every day, so that every day, when that door opens and she walks down the aisle to you, she is more glorious, she is more radiant even than the day before. That's the picture, that's the comparison that Paul is making here in Ephesians chapter 5. You look at this, right? Christ has loved the church, and he has given himself up for the church. Why? Ultimately, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor or in glory, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she might be holy and without blemish. Jesus has sacrificed, and he is working to make his church, his bride, holy, so that he can present her to himself as a glorious, radiant bride. Jesus has given himself and is working so that he would have a bride who is beautiful in holiness. And as Paul is making this comparison, again, I don't want to draw this too tightly, right? Because Paul doesn't actually come back around and give us the exact point of correspondence. He doesn't say, okay, that's what Jesus did to make his church holy. Now, husbands, here's exactly what you should do for your wife. He doesn't give us the exact point of correspondence there. But husbands, you are called to do something comparable, and you are able to do something comparable in your own marriage as you give yourself for your wife. That you can give yourself for her and serve her in ways that increase her splendor, her radiance. And ultimately, that gives you a more and more glorious bride each and every day. Jesus is working to present to himself a glorious bride, and Paul says there's something comparable to that for you husbands. So like I said last week, right, guys, it just makes sense. It just makes sense to love your wife well. It just makes sense. That's Paul's tone, Paul's plea here in this passage. It makes sense, guys, to give yourself up in loving your wife. And so this week, as we pick up in verse 28, and we go all the way down through verse 31 and maybe dip into verse 32 a little bit, we're going to see Paul gives us three premises in his logical argument. Three premises in his argument for why it makes sense. It just makes good sense to love your wife as yourself. Let me read this for us, starting in verse 28. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. All right, so you want to see three premises, three steps in Paul's logical argument as he works to convince you husbands that it makes sense to love your wife. And he makes this transition here. Paul makes this transition here in verse 28. He says, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Now, when he does that, I think on the one hand, Paul is structurally signaling a new section. He's introducing a new section, a new topic, because he makes a new comparison. You know, and this is things that you should be looking for in your Bible. You should be looking for things that are parallel, because that gives you kind of structural markers for how the author is ordering and structuring his thoughts. Back up here, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So that's one picture, one comparison for husbands of how we are to love our wives. And then in verse 28, now he introduces a second comparison. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. So husbands, you should love your wife as Christ loved the church. Love your wife like Christ loved the church. And husbands, you should love your wife as you love your own body, like you love your own self. So I think these two are parallel. He's got one section here and then one section down here. This is love your wife like Christ loved the church. This is love your wife like you love yourself. But he also connects this back to what he said earlier by using this little phrase, in the same way. In the same way. So husbands, you are to love your wife like you love yourself, as you love your own body, in the same way as something else. And you guys know I'm a grammar nerd, right? I geek out on grammar, but it's important because there's a missing thought here. There's an implied thought. You should love your wife as your own body in the same way as what? In the same way as somebody else loves somebody. Okay? So you need to love your wife as your own body in the same way, and we would certainly say in the same way as Christ does something. But what exactly is he connecting to back here? And I think it's important for us to understand this. You're going to see that it's important in just a moment. Look at what he says about Christ. Christ loves the church. Christ loved the church. He gave himself up for her so that he might present the church to himself. Okay? So Christ gave himself up for the church. He loved the church so that he might give the church to himself in holiness and in glory. In the same way, husbands, you love your wife like you love yourself. Christ gave himself in order to give the church back to himself. Husbands, love your wife like you love yourself. That's I think, the in the same way part. So keep that in mind and follow me as I walk through what he's saying. I think the point of correspondence becomes very clear. The comparison he's making when he says in the same way, it becomes more clear when you look at the second half of verse 28. In the second half of verse 28, you should look at the second half of verse 28 and be like, huh? He who loves his wife loves himself. At first glance, you should probably be taken aback by that. Wives, you might read that, and maybe you would be taken aback by that. He who loves his wife loves himself. It sounds kind of selfish. It sounds actually like maybe Paul is condoning selfishness. Like, husbands, yeah, love your wife, but love your wife because of how it benefits you. And look, there is a way that this can be twisted or misapplied. Big time, right? A husband can maybe do nice things for his wife or treat his wife a certain way in order to try to get what he wants. But folks, that's not this. That's not verse 28. That's actually not love. That's manipulation, right? There's another sense, and I think when we use this phrase, remember I said last week, we have the phrase in our culture, happy wife, happy life. And maybe Paul would actually say, holy wife, happy life. I think when that phrase, happy wife, happy life, gets used, oftentimes what that really means for a guy is, hey, you just need to capitulate to your wife on everything. Just let her get what she wants. Kind of pander to her a little bit, because if you don't, she's going to be angry, and you don't want her to be angry. That's not love. That's not this kind of sacrificial love that Paul is talking about here. That's actually cowardice and people-pleasing. Okay? What Paul is talking about here when he says, he who loves his wife loves himself, he's not talking about manipulation. He's not talking about people-pleasing or pandering or capitulating. He's saying, no, when you actually do this, when you actually love her in a Christ-like way, when you actually give yourself up for her in a genuine Christ-like way, then men, husbands, you are loving yourself by doing that. When you love her in a real Christ-like way. And you might say, how can that be? How can that be? And why would Paul say this, right? How can real Christ-like love have any element of this kind of self-benefit to it? It sounds selfish. But that's where this comparison becomes really important. Understanding when he says, what does he mean by in the same way? Love your wife as your own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. In the same way that Jesus actually practiced this dynamic. Because what did it say? Jesus gave himself for the church. Why? To present her to himself. Did Jesus die for the church for her good or for his good? I mean, what does it say? It says he did it so that he would have a radiant bride. Did he do it for her or did he do it for him? And you know what? The answer to that question is yes. The answer is yes, and we just sang it, didn't we? We know that he is working for his glory and our good, except in this passage, he is working for, this word, splendor, comes from the word glory. That is the word glory, actually. In this case, Jesus was working for her glory, which is his good as her husband. And so the answer is both. Did Jesus do it for us or for him? Yes, both. And you're like, isn't that selfish? No. It's love. It's love. That's how love works, actually. And this truth actually gets us right down to the very heart of what love actually is and what Christianity is really all about. Okay, and I'm just going to shamelessly rip off a John Piper story. Okay, I'm not even going to pretend like I'm not. I'm just going to tell the John Piper story like verbatim the way he tells it because it's so helpful for understanding this dynamic. John Piper tells the story of his wife is Noelle, and on their 50th wedding anniversary, he said he went out and bought her, 50 roses, hundreds of dollars worth of roses, and she loves roses, and so he goes and comes home after work, and instead of just going into his house like he normally would, he rings the doorbell. His wife comes to the door, and she answers the door, and he's down on one knee and takes the roses out from behind his back and hands them to her, says, "Happy anniversary, Noelle." And she looks at the giant bouquet of roses and she says, "Oh, Johnny, why did you?" And he says, "Because I love you so much and I love to see you so happy." Now, what's her response going to be to that? Is she gonna respond to that and say, "John Piper, you are the most selfish Christian hedonist I have ever met in my entire life. You bought me these roses because you love to see me happy. So really, you're saying you bought me these roses because you wanted to be happy at seeing me happy. Well, you can take your roses, your selfish Christian hedonist roses, and you can go take those and go sleep somewhere else tonight." Is that going to be her response? No. Because actually, think about the opposite. Think about the alternative. She says, "Johnny, why did you?" And he says, "Because it was my duty." Is that an answer that communicates love? No, but intuitively we know when he says, "I love you so much. I love to see you happy. It makes me so happy to see you happy." That doesn't denigrate his love. That doesn't pollute the purity of his love. That his happiness in her happiness is actually the greatest expression of love. Folks, what is love besides rejoicing and delighting in someone else's good? Isn't that what it means to care about somebody? When their good makes you happy. And that's what this dynamic is supposed to be like in a marriage. And that's what the dynamic is supposed to be like between us and God. And that's actually what the dynamic is between God and us. That's how God's love for us works. That's how our love for God is supposed to work. And that's how our love for other people is supposed to work as well. That we would say, "Yeah, I care about you in such a way that your good brings me joy. I love God in such a way that I love it when God is glorified. And so when I work for God's glory, when I do things for God's glory, it makes me happy that God is being glorified." And now, am I doing it for God's glory or for my happiness in God's glory? And the answer is yes. And as John Piper would say over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? God is most glorified in you when you are most satisfied in him. When his glory makes you happy, then that actually glorifies God even more. And that's what it means for this love to not be selfish. Husbands, when you delight in your wife like that, when you delight in your wife like that in such a way that you just love her good, Her good makes you happy, and you love to see her growing in holiness and radiance, and you rejoice over her, then yeah, guess what? When you work for her good, you're working for your good too. When you love her sacrificially like this, the benefit comes right back to you in the form of your joy in her good. It's a wonderful dynamic. Here's what I want to say. There might be some of you who are sitting there thinking, man, like that dynamic is just not in my marriage. Like I don't like maybe at one point I did, but I don't have that kind of delight in my wife. And men, that means you need to start fighting for it. You need to start fighting for it in here. If there's no delight, it's time to fight, not with her, but within yourself to say, God, I want to be like Christ and delight myself in my bride the same way that Jesus does in his. That her good, her radiance would make me happy, would bring me joy. Guys, if that's where you're at, right? If there's a marriage where you just say, man, yeah, like that dynamic isn't there in my heart right now, it's a decision, but it's a fight to say, okay, God, you gotta bring me back to that place. Real delight in my wife and care for her. Come talk to me. Come talk to Matt. Come talk to Joe. Guys, let's help you get to that place. To be able to say, yeah, when I love my wife, I am loving myself because I love to see her good. That's Paul's first premise here. Premise number one is that when you love husbands, when you love your wife, if you're doing it properly, then you are actually loving yourself. You're working for your own good in working for hers. That's premise number one. Premise number two is verse 29. No one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ does the church. Okay, so premise number one, you love your wife, you are loving yourself. Premise number two in his argument is this. Guess what, guys? If by loving your wife you are loving yourself, then you should love your wife because it just makes sense to love yourself. You see? You love it if. It's like the transitive property, math, anybody? Yeah? If A equals B, B equals C. Okay. If by loving your wife you're loving yourself, then you should love your wife because it makes a lot of sense to love yourself. And again, you're like, okay, this sounds off. This is just what Paul's saying. He said, look, no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. You take care of yourself. I think this part here at the beginning, no one ever hated his own flesh. That's kind of proverbial. We would look at that and say, okay, is that strictly true? No. But Paul's point is to look and say, it doesn't make any sense to hate your own flesh. It doesn't make any sense to do bad things to yourself. It makes sense to treat your own flesh well. You do that naturally. In the same way, it makes sense to treat your wife, to love your wife. What does that look like? What does it look like? What does it look like when Paul talks about loving yourself? And that, right, even when I say that term has been taken by the world, and so we load a lot of baggage into that term when I say love yourself. Take all that baggage away and just, these are Paul's words, right? He's talking about loving yourself. What does he mean when he talks about what it looks like to love your own flesh? Because by implication, husbands, the ways that you love your own flesh, that's the way that you should turn around and you should love your wife. He's giving us this picture. Husbands, what does it look like to love your own flesh? Well, he uses these two words. And these words are so important. These are words that they come up a lot in marriage counseling. These are words that I like to go to a lot in marriage counseling. Nourish and cherish. Nourish and cherish. Paul says, you nourish and cherish your own body. You nourish and cherish your own flesh. And that's what you should do with your wife. What do those words mean? Nourish, the same way it does in English, that's a word about food. Okay? It's a word about feeding. Nourish, give food to help someone to grow. And then cherish. Cherish is a fun word. It's a fun word also because typically in a marriage, right, the wife is always cold and the husband is always too warm. And so they even make these beds now. You can adjust the temperature on each side of the bed. This word for cherish is the word for almost like cuddling somebody up in a blanket to keep them warm. So with your own body, you do this. You nourish your own body. You feed your own body. You know when you're hungry and you give your body what it needs. You know what the temperature is. You can feel, okay, I'm not comfortable right now. It's too cold or it's too hot. This is how you take care of your body. You give it food, and you give it the warmth that it needs. Both of these words, I think the picture that he's painting here is just of this tender, attentive care. Tender, attentive care. And so men, husbands, when you look at your marriage, do you tenderly provide for the needs of your wife? Look out for the needs of your wife. Care for her with love and just gentleness, like somebody coming along and wrapping a blanket around somebody who's cold. Is that your attitude towards your wife? And let me just ask you a few questions to identify that. Husbands, do you know what she needs? Are you attentive to the needs of your wife? You do that for yourself, right? You do that for yourself. You're very aware of what you want or what you need or what would make you feel more comfortable. Are you attentive to the needs of your wife, where you are looking out for her needs actively? Are you looking for ways to strategically give her what she needs and is good for her? Do you think about your wife and think, okay, where is she at now? And what does she need? What would be helpful for her? Spiritually or just physically? What can I do to nourish and cherish her in this tender, loving way? And then, again, this tenderness, this care. Guys, think about how you can do that extravagantly. Because I'm pretty sure you do that for yourself, right? You take very good care of yourself. How can you look at the needs of your wife and say, how can I be generous and extravagant in my tender care for my wife with intentionality? And then I think the fun thing about that is that you should love doing it. When was the last time you ever heard somebody complain about taking care of themselves? It's been a while since I've heard that. But guys, so you look and say, okay, I see the needs of my wife, and I want to provide for those needs, and I want to figure out how to nourish her, to cherish her, how to just tenderly give her what she needs. And I love to do that. In the same way that I love to take care of myself. Here's what I run into sometimes, guys. You can be a great provider, right? You can bring home lots of money. You can even be a strong leader in your home. You can run your home very well. You can be a very hard worker, and you can sacrificially do all kinds of things around the house for your wife. But if you don't nourish and cherish her, then you're missing this. You're missing what it looks like to be a godly, Christ-like husband. You can go work hard around the house all day, but if there isn't this tenderness and attentiveness to your wife to say, okay, I want to lavish good things upon you, you're missing this nourish and cherish part. And you're missing something in this picture of what it looks like to be a Christ-like husband, because what does Paul say? This is what Christ does for the church. Jesus nourishes and cherishes us, his body. How does he do that? Doesn't he give us what we need? And doesn't he love to give us what we need? And doesn't Jesus always know just what we need? How many times do you look back in your life and you say, man, I was going this way and I didn't even know this is what I needed, but God knew this is what I needed right then. And he gave it to me. And it says that he loves to give it to you, right? How much more does your Father in heaven love to give good gifts, give good things to those who ask him? And he does it with gentleness, and he does it with tenderness, and he does it with compassion. Just think, husbands, think about how Jesus leads you. Think about how Jesus treats you. He does not treat you as your sins deserve. Think about Christ, husbands. Think about how he sees your sin. Think about how he sees your sanctification. Okay, Jesus looks at you, husbands, and you are over here. And Jesus wants you to be over here in terms of your holiness and your sanctification. But he does not say, all right, you're here, I want you to be here, get moving! He cracks the whip and just, right? That's not how Jesus treats you. He doesn't say, all right, there's all these things, I want you to be over here, and you're over here, so you got to do this, and this, and here's all of it all at once, now just go and do it. That's not how Jesus treats you. He knows where you are and where you need to be. But he leads you one step at a time with gentleness and compassion. He knows your frailty, and he knows your struggle, and he knows your weaknesses. And he knows the things that he knows, right now, they can't do that. And so I'm going to give them something else. And we're going to take the long way around. It'd be a lot faster if they were just ready to take this big step, but they're not. So we're going to take the long way around because it's less steep of a climb. That's how Jesus leads and shepherds you with tenderness and kindness and compassion to nourish and cherish you. Husbands, that's how you treat your wife. You lead her. You think about her sanctification. Think about her sanctification, but remember how Jesus treats you in your sanctification. Patiently, gently. So this is, that's premise number 2. Premise number 2 is it makes sense. You treat your own flesh this way. It just makes sense to treat your wife this way. Because premise number 3 is this, okay? It makes sense to love yourself, and guess what? She is yourself. She is yourself. So you see the logic here? You love your wife, you are loving yourself. It makes sense to love yourself. She is yourself, so love her. And that's where Paul comes back. He gives us 2 things, right? Christ treats the church this way. Christ nourishes and cherishes the church. Why? Because we are members of his body. We are part of his body. In our union with Christ, we have actually become one with him. And so when Jesus nourishes and cherishes the church, he is nourishing and cherishing himself. Because we are his body. It's an interesting thing to think about too. You ever think about how the church is both the body and the bride of Christ? It's kind of an interesting deal, right? How we could be both of those things. I think Paul kind of clears it up here. Verse 31. So now he's going to quote from Genesis chapter 2. It says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." The next verse is going to say, this mystery is profound, but I am talking about Christ in the church, which means to say, Paul says, verse 31, this is actually also true of Christ in the church. We are his body and his bride, and that actually makes sense because your bride is part of your body. This is just such a foundational truth, right? The fact that in the marriage union, the two become one. So guys, she is you. She is part of you. And so it makes sense to treat her, to love her like part of you. And yet, how often do we forget that, husbands? And actually both, right? Wives too. How often do you forget that you are one body with him? You are part of him. You are part of each other. I coached t-ball for a little while when my son was playing t-ball, and you have this experience. You drive by the park, or maybe you got kids or grandkids who are playing like little kids soccer, right? Little kids soccer. Like, what are we doing here? Kind of soccer. I get it. There's probably some value in it, but t-ball too. I remember coaching the t-ball team, and the ball gets dribbles out into center field, and four kids, they're all playing defense, they're on the same team. They all run for it. They start fighting each other over it. You see these little kids' soccer games, and what are they doing? They're all just bunched out. They used to call it bunch ball. All just bunched up in a ball, huddle around the ball, and they're kicking it at each other. And 3/4 of them are in that circle. They're on the same team. I remember playing little kids soccer. And I actually wasn't even that little. I had a coach, and he would just yell, "Same team! Same team!" And honestly, there are times, right, when we need somebody in our marriage to just be standing on the sidelines yelling that at us. Same team. Same team. And actually, in our house, that's transformed into one level deeper. Same person. When there's a conflict, there's a disagreement, and we start to be in conflict about something, and one of us starts to get angry, that's something that we say. Hey, same person. Same person. We are one. So your good is my good, and my good is your good. So let's just work together to figure this out. It just makes sense, right? If she really is part of you, and you are part of her, to love this way. Wrapping up, guys, that picture of her coming down the aisle to you every single day, that you would be working, actually, you get to present her to yourself every single day. Man, I just hope you can see the tremendous benefit and the tremendous picture of Christ and the church that it is for you to love your wife this way. And guys, I've just been praying that you would be renewed in your passion, in your resolve, and in your delight in your wife. And say, man, I want to present her to me as a more and more radiant bride each day. And I want to do whatever I can for her to make that happen. Ultimately, because that's what Christ does for me and is doing for us. So let me pray, and then I think we'll go out and have some burgers, right? Okay. Father, thank you for this, just again, the clear instruction from your word. We love the clear instruction in your word. You don't leave us guessing. You give us great detail about how to live in a way that glorifies you and why to live in a way that glorifies you. You haven't just given us a list of rules, but you have actually done so much to help us in your compassion, your tenderness, in your nourishing and cherishing of us, that you have led us along in your word by giving us very good and compelling reasons why we should do the things that you say, why we should do it your way. And I pray that as the husbands of this church would walk this out, would live this out, that each one would have a tenderness towards his wife. Each one would delight in the good of his wife. And that marriages would glorify you here at Gospel Community Church. Father, help us each as we find our place in that line, that order that you've established. God, that you would be glorified, that you'd be honored as we walk worthy of the gospel in these ways. We thank you so much, God, and we pray in Jesus' name, amen.